Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Thank you for tuning into the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Shubh, and welcome back. It's Marvel Episode 6. So, a bit of an update on the way things are going right now. I think I like this, one movie per episode sort of deal. So I think I'm going to continue with that for the time being. Obviously, there will be a certain slew of movies that I don't really want to go in depth on, so I'll sort of try to combine all of them together. One that comes to mind is Doctor Strange. I don't really like Doctor Strange that much, but it's also been a long time since I watched it again, so who knows, maybe my thoughts on that might change by the episode that I do Doctor Strange on. But more importantly, more urgently, today's episode we're going to be discussing Ant-Man. So let's get into it. Now, as a medium, comic books, incredibly silly. But even by most of the standards that we know and hold comic books to, Ant-Man is a superhero that shrinks to the size of an ant. That's it. And that's pretty silly. But despite, being a founding member of the Avengers in the comics, Ant-Man, it never really caught on as a comic book. And still somehow, the 12th movie in the MCU in terms of release, Marvel gave this character a big screen adaptation. So, the way they did with Guardians of the Galaxy, we're seeing Marvel sort of take that risk again. Development of this film, it goes back to the early days of Marvel Studios, but the film obviously was heavily delayed because it doesn't really have that force behind it. After the huge success of the Avengers, as I mention in every episode now, the studio had this confidence and boldness, and they did stuff like Guardians of the Galaxy or Ant-Man. And eventually the risk paid off. It paid off with a smaller degree on Ant-Man, but still paid off for sure. I'm not being annoying, but small is really the key word when it comes to Ant-Man. So pardon me for its usage. I understand that small might be a word that you might be sick of hearing about Ant-Man. But the plot, it doesn't feature, like other Marvel movies do, particularly world-ending stakes. It focuses on a heist. It's a heist movie at the end of the day. The tone, it's not serious. It's light. It's comedic. It's very suited to Paul Rudd. With the father-daughter dynamic, there's very strong emotional stakes. The characters are incredible. But they're all rooted in something small. That's what makes Ant-Man different. It's a palate cleanser for the MCU. It proves that not every Marvel movie needs to be huge, like in terms of everything, to be successful. Sometimes silliness and just shrinking works better. So, in the comic books, Dr. Pym, Hank Pym, first appeared in Tales to Astonish number 27. In 1962. This is when the Marvel Comics sort of output was mostly science fiction and horror anthology books. So in the first story, written by Stan Lee and Larry Lieber, It was also drawn by Jack Kirby, the legendary the Marvel illustrator. Hank Pym, he's a scientist who shrinks himself and has a frightening experience in an anthill. It sounds like what Batman should have been. It was a one-off thing, like most Marvel studios, like most Marvel stories at the time. But it was published right after Fantastic Four #1, and Marvel started to transition into superhero comics. Stan Lee thought it would be fun to bring Pym back in Tales to Astonish #35 in 1962. He changed him around to a shrinking superhero named Ant-Man. Superheroes took over Marvel Comics at this point, and Ant-Man became the regular star of these Tales to Astonish. Eventually, they introduced Janet Van Dyne, who's Hank Pym's wife, as Pym's lab assistant, but immediately also becomes his fighting partner, the Wasp, and obviously romantic interest. Ant-Man and the Wasp, they're founding members of the Avengers. They show up in Avengers #1 in 1963, and Pym even reverses his shrinking formula to become Giant Man. But Ant-Man and the Wasp, it never got to that widespread popularity like the other Marvel characters. They seemed like third-string characters, behind people like Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, Hulk, Thor, X-Men, Daredevil, even Doctor Strange. Eventually, they stopped becoming the stars of Tales to Astonish and even left the Avengers in 1965. But they were strong supporting characters for the most part. They had great stories in later issues of the Avengers. But even then, the Wasp was particularly better received, especially when the writers replaced her, 60s flirty, flighty attitude with an actual personality. But, she doesn't show up in this film, so I'm going to save that for later. Pym is a lot more tumultuous, a lot more problematic. He has mental health issues and inferiority complex, fitting for a man who shrinks for a living. And he created Ultron, one of the Avengers' most enduring foes. He expresses guilt, obviously, over that mistake, and throughout the years has to change his superhero persona. Ant-Man, Giant Man, Goliath, Yellow Jacket, even the Wasp. He is very erratic, sometimes violent, and he infamously even strikes Janet in an argument that causes him to get expelled from the Avengers. Marvel heroes, they're deeply flawed and human people, but Hank Pym goes further. Because he's not just deeply flawed, he's troubling. And he's not just human, he's fascinating. In the late 70s, Hank Pym was changing personas constantly, acting very erratic, and the writer at the time saw the opportunity to pass the Ant-Man mantle down. So they created Scott Lang, who was a reformed burglar and a Stark security consultant, and became the new Ant-Man in Marvel Premiere 47-48 in 1979. In these issues, Scott Lang's daughter, Cassie, is sick. So when the doctor wants to perform Cassie's surgery, gets kidnapped by Darren Cross. All of these names will sound familiar to you because they're in the movie. Scott Lang steals the original Ant-Man suit to save his daughter. And then obviously Hank Pym gives him his blessing to continue as Ant-Man. Scott Lang sort of appears here and there over various comics in various years, but Pym, just like him, he didn't gain that type of popularity. He officially joined in 2003 for the Avengers, but dies in 2004. And then Cassie goes on to become a part of the Young Avengers. Side note here, I don't know if I want to see a Young Avengers movie. I feel like if Disney goes that way, it's going to be like High School Musical and a superhero movie. And while that sounds enticing, we already have Sky High. But who knows? Let's see.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Anyway, the team then, they save Lang through time travel. The concept of, passing a sort of mantle down from character to character, it's not very common in Marvel Comics. It's more of a DC thing. But because of Pym being just very problematic and neither Ant-Man sort of being very widespread, the filmmakers of Ant-Man thought, why not just include both? Stan Lee, he wanted to do an Ant-Man film in the late 80s, around, the Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. Makes sense. But it never gained traction. In May 2000, Ant-Man was one of 15 Marvel properties that also went with Thor, Black Panther, Captain America, all licensed to a company called Artisan Entertainment for film adaptations. In 2003, Artisan started taking these Marvel-related pitches, and Edgar Wright pitched an Ant-Man film focused on Scott Lang, and it was a heist film, and it had an edgy sort of comic quality to it. Nothing eventually came of that pitch, obviously, although I would have loved to see that. Artisan was purchased by Lionsgate. Edgar Wright went on to do Shaun of the Dead. But they held on to their Ant-Man idea and even mentioned it to Kevin Feige in 2004 when Feige launched Marvel Studios. He hired Edgar Wright. Yeah, he was hired to write and direct Ant-Man. So it entered development with Iron Man and the Incredible Hulk. So at this point, you have Edgar Wright's story that's focused on Scott Lang, but also includes Hank Pym. It loosely adapts the first Scott Lang story. It involves Scott's daughter Cassie. Darren Cross is the villain. But the film, it wasn't prioritized by Marvel, obviously. And they decided to save this for maybe post-Avengers. It meant that Ant-Man wouldn't co-found the Avengers like he does in the comics. But at the same time, we get Edgar Wright to do 2 more films, Hot Fuzz and Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. And by 2012, the screenplay was finalized. Edgar Wright directed a test sequence that was shown at Comic-Con, and it got great acclaim. And Marvel released a 2015 release date for Ant-Man. At this point, Edgar Wright finished The World's End and finally began to focus on Ant-Man. By 2014, Edgar Wright had his crew and his main cast, including Paul Rudd, Michael Douglas, Evangeline Lilly. But in 2014, in May, after 8 years of project work, Edgar Wright left Ant-Man. In his words, he wanted to make a Marvel movie, but Marvel didn't want to make an Edgar Wright movie. Now, I'm having trouble figuring out what that means, but I can imagine there would have been some creative differences around that. Marvel insisted on hiring other writers to rewrite and polish the screenplay, probably to bring it more in line with the MCU and really dull it down so it can fit the masses. Wright only directs films that he's written, and didn't feel comfortable having his screenplay changed by someone else. And members of the cast claimed that Edgar Wright's screenplay was fantastic, but it might not have fit well in the rest of the MCU. But that might just be a press tactic. Eventually, Adam McKay was asked to rewrite and direct, but he declined out of respect for Edgar Wright. He and Rudd sort of revamped the screenplay, and Marvel hired Peyton Reed to direct. And the overall structure of the film, including Scott stealing the Ant-Man suit, being mentored, planning a heist, the action climax, they were all present in Edgar Wright's screenplay. McKay and Rudd's rewrite added scenes involving the quantum realm, Hank's wife, as well as a very important scene in the Avengers headquarters. These events sort of seem like they were more there to bring the film closer to the MCU and set up more MCU things, which is what Wright didn't really want. Edgar Wright has a very loyal fan base, and there were a lot of concerns that his departure would sort of be a bad thing for Ant-Man's audience. And, a lot of public production conflicts. There was a last-minute director change, obviously, rewrites, uncredited writers. It usually means trouble for a film, but miraculously, the new director hired, Peyton Reed, and his collaborators, they made a movie beyond any expectations. You couldn't notice, I didn't know that there was any behind-the-scenes drama. Ant-Man, it's this fun, breezy, refreshing, small, intimate Marvel movie that has a lot of success and quality in spite of its unpopular source material and even the public production issues. So that's honestly one of the greatest achievements of the studio. So this movie, it opens in 1989 with the Triskelion. It was last seen in The Winter Soldier getting destroyed, so it was nice to be back. Hank Pym goes into a meeting of S.H.I.E.L.D. leaders with Howard Stark, Peggy Carter, and Mitchell Carson, and learns that S.H.I.E.L.D. is secretly attempting to replicate his shrinking formula, or Pym particles. Douglas here has been digitally de-aged, and this is pre The Irishman, so it's doesn't really look that nice. And Haley Atwell has been aged up 40 years. The director at this point was concerned, Peyton Reed, he was concerned with this being the first scene because the poor effects might have sort of turned people off. His concerns were unfounded, and, people seemed to buy the aging effects, so it worked. The scene, it sets up Hank Pym's work as Ant-Man and, the loss of Janet, his animosity with S.H.I.E.L.D., and Pym's insistence that he doesn't want his work to end up in the wrong hands. But the most important part of this scene is that you place Hank Pym in the history of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Ant-Man might have been missing as one of the founders of the Avengers in the MCU, but at least Hank Pym was one of the founders of S.H.I.E.L.D. Eventually, the movie moves on to the present day with a close-up of Scott Lang, played by Paul Rudd, being punched in the face in prison. Turns out it's part of a goodbye ritual and not a fight like it's framed to be on the night before Scott is released. And here Paul Rudd seems very gruff and disheveled. It's not like we're used to seeing him, but there's no hiding that typical Paul Rudd charm. Scott is in prison for burglary. He blew the whistle on his old employer's questionable business practices, and that got him fired. And, he responded, obviously, by leaking the company records online and broke into and vandalized the CEO's home, which got him sent to prison. There's a tension here, between wanting to be true to Scott's origins as in the comics, as a reformed convict, and not wanting him to be too much of a bad guy. It's a sort of his crimes are always Robin Hoody, and that's the sort of sense that Marvel got put forward to the audience. Eventually, he moves out of jail, and moves into an apartment with ex-cons Luis, Dave, and Kurt, played by Michael Pena, T.I., and David Dastmalchian. Lovely name. Luis, he comes to Scott with a burglary job, but Scott wants to stay straight because he wants to see his daughter again. It's not easy. Scott gets a job at Baskin-Robbins, but he gets fired right away as soon as they discover the fact that he's a criminal. Baskin-Robbins always finds out is a line that's stuck out there. He's obviously behind on child support, so his ex-wife Maggie and her fiancé, who's a cop, Jim, played by Bobby Cannavale, they don't let him see his daughter. There's a little bit of social commentary here about the challenges facing convicted felons once they've paid their debt to society. You know, they run out of options and they're forced back into a life of crime. And that's what happens to Scott because he's run out of options and he has to take Luis up on the burglary job. One of the benefits of this movie using Scott Lang as the main protagonist, I think, is that, you know, it really grounds the MCU because Scott Lang is an everyman. He's just trying to do his best in like a really weird world and trying to be with his daughter. He's a very talented and smart person, but he's more relatable than most of the other MCU heroes. You know, he's not a super genius like Bruce Banner. He's not super rich like Iron Man. He's not an assassin like Black Widow or even like a trained fighter. He can't even shoot arrows like Hawkeye. He's just an ordinary person doing really crazy things because he's in a cool suit. And I know that sounds like Iron Man, but Iron Man is a billionaire. Of course, you know, you have to credit Paul Rudd for this. He has this beautiful, funny persona that just sells Scott completely. Anyway, so Scott accepts this job, and it leads to what becomes one of Ant-Man's sort of Hall of Fame cinematic language usage. It becomes a part of the cinematic language of this film, is what I'm trying to say. He goes into Luis's tip montage, which is an iconic sequence. Scott insists of knowing how Luis wanted to sort of found out about the burglary job. So Luis tells him in a very particular tangent, verbal diarrhea, let's call it. He explains that an old man has a large vault in his basement, that he's going to be out of town, and the old man's housekeeper told her boyfriend, who's Luis's brother, who told Luis. As Luis tells the tale, the film cuts to these characters, and they're all chain lip syncing to Luis's dialogue, so it sounds really funny. And Luis also, you know, he gets distracted and goes into tangents, like I said. So he talks about his love of wine or the personal histories of all the characters in a sequence. It's fantastic. And it launches the film straight into its first heist. And here, another montage. We get Scott, Luis, Dave, and Kurt trying to bypass security, get into the house. Scott faces some obstacles, like a fingerprint scanner. And he bypasses each. And it demonstrates all of his problem-solving skills. Now we have a hero that we can sort of really appreciate in terms of what kind of toolbox he's working with. All of this is getting watched by Hank. Now, Hank Pym's wife, Janet, was lost shortly before he left S.H.I.E.L.D., like we established in the first scene. He has his daughter named Hope, who was 7 at the time, who's around Cassie's age, actually. And Hank then goes on to start Pym Technologies and became increasingly estranged with his daughter. He also kept his Pym particles very close. These particles, they shrink the space between atoms that allow objects to become smaller and more dense. It's a very closely guarded secret, as it should be. And Hank eventually gets pushed out of his company by Hope and Darren Cross. in a allusion to the comics, or sort of some borrowing from the comics, Darren Cross has been pursuing shrinking technology because he doesn't have access to Hanks. He's perfected shrinking inorganic matter, and it works very easily for him, and almost gets to shrinking organic matter. But he wants to use and sell this technology to the highest bidder for combat use. It's worrying for Hope and Hank because they obviously it's the wrong thing to do, so they conspire to stop Cross. Hope still is on Cross's side in Cross's mind, so so she wants to use the Ant-Man suit to stop him, but Hank insists on bringing someone else in, a smart person with burglary skills, or as someone can refer to it, as we should refer to it, patriarchal nepotism. So he finds Scott, and all of that is arranged by him organizing the heist in his own. Scott, he sees the suit, he gets the suit and is disappointed, but he tries it on because curiosity. And he presses the button on the glove and immediately shrinks down to the size of an ant. Now this is beautiful. There's outlines of Scott lingering as he shrinks. There's a decreasing progression. It's dynamic, and it looks like the comic books. It's beautiful. It doesn't seem... It's better than, building these like goofy looking huge sets, or even digital sets completely. Here, Peyton Reed used macro photography, which is like ultra close-up filming, to capture the shrunken perspective of some of the scenes, and then digitally placed Paul Rudd in those shots. It's incredible when you come look at the detail, because you can see very large dust particles, and there's echoing and sound distortion, and it all helps to keep that illusion going.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
So Hank speaks to Scott through the helmet. Now, at this point, Scott has no idea what's going on, so having a voice come in through the helmet is obviously quite startling. And he tells him that it's a test. Pretty much the worst situation you'd want to be in. Scott has to then outrun a flood of water as Louis starts a bath. He jumps out of his bathtub, falling through the cracks in the floor, and ends up writing a vinyl record in the club downstairs. Scott runs around the dance floor. He avoids stomping feet, and then he falls into a vent and through another apartment. He gets vacuumed up, and during this whole sequence, the film is establishing its rules for shrinking. Scott can run fast. He can jump very high. He's tough because of his added density, and he escapes the vacuum. He then runs into a dinosaur-sized rat and jumps out of the window to escape. He lands eventually on the top of a car, and besides, he makes a dent in it. Besides establishing these rules, the sequence, it also demonstrates the fun that can be had with such interesting and unique superpowers. Naturally, Scott is traumatized by the event and returns the suit, but gets arrested. And while in jail, Jim expresses disappointment that Scott couldn't turn things around again. Hank goes to meet Scott and breaks him out in order to have him sort of reunite with Cassie. Scott naturally agrees, and he escapes by shrinking in the suit and riding on an ant. He makes it back to Hank's house, and Hope makes it clear that she does not want him around. And Hank gives him the heist. They have to destroy Cross's research, his cross particles, and his shrinking combat suit, the Yellow Jacket, another homage to the comics, before he sells the technology. Scott also has to perfect the use of the Ant-Man suit, including the ability to communicate and control ants, and eventually break into Pym Technologies to take down everything Darren Cross is working on. Hank eventually relates to Scott over their daughters, and he places this mission as a chance to prove for not only him but also for Hank themselves to the daughters, who have pretty much lost faith in them. The next section of this film is basically just a heist film. The MCU obviously was experimenting with putting superhero movies in different genres, and Ant-Man is a heist superhero film. Now you get the assembly of the characters, and the film proceeds to hit pretty much every major beat of a heist film. Now, one of these is a clear planning sequence. This is important because the audiences need to sort of understand the plan beforehand to understand if the heist is going right or wrong. So if viewers are confused during the heist, obviously they're not going to engage. So Scott, Hope, and Hank discuss the three objectives of the break-in. 1, to fry Cross's computer. 2, to blow up the Cross particles. And 3, to steal the Yellow Jacket suit. But the planning montage also includes Scott's training to use the Ant-Man suit. And that happens with Hope. He has to practice fast shrinking. He goes through ant hills, tinkers with the suit, meets a bunch of different types of ants. It also explores an opportunity for these characters to finally interact with each other. There's an interesting dynamic between Hank and Scott. Hank is this gruff mentor, and he has a very tense working relationship with Hope, obviously, as well, because of their estrangement. Hope is not very interested in having Scott around, and she wants to do the heist herself, and obviously resents Hank for holding her back. And Scott, he's sort of a mediator in between both of them. He cuts that tension with Paul Rudd's undeniable charm. Eventually, the tensions come to a peak when Hope criticizes Scott for being unable to control the ants and storms out. Scott chases after her and explains that he's expendable, and Hank is more willing to risk his life rather than Hope's. Hope obviously calms down here and warms up to Scott for the first time. At the point of their return, Hank decides to explain what actually happened to Hope's mother. Janet is explained to be Hope's mother, but also the partner of Ant-Man the Wasp. In 1987, Hank and Janet had to stop a missile fire to the US, and the only way to do so was to infiltrate and disable the mission. But they couldn't do that because they weren't small enough. So the only way they could do that was if they turned off the regulator in their suits and shrunk to a subatomic level. But unfortunately, Janet shrank endlessly until she was lost to the quantum realm. After this, Hank, he became a workaholic. He tried to find Janet and eventually became estranged from his daughter in the process. And now he doesn't want Hope wearing the same suit because he has a fear that he will lose her. It's obviously all news to Hope, which finally brings her closer to Hank again. The next important heist beat, is the pre-heist heist. When you need to steal something in order to complete the main heist. It's an opportunity to demonstrate the relationships and the progress that these characters have made together during the planning. In Ant-Man, it's also a great way to introduce Scott into the larger MCU. because Hank needs this very poorly explained old invention. We don't even know what it's used for. And it's stored at an old Stark facility in upstate New York. Now, he sends Scott to receive it as is his final test, sort of. But before they realize, they find out that this is the new Avengers headquarters as of Age of Ultron. And Scott is immediately detected by the Falcon. Now, this is one of the funniest sequences. He introduces himself as Scott and proudly Ant-Man, which obviously Falcon sort of laughs at. They fight. It's very common in superhero comics, the tenseness of a guest star in another hero's story. The filmmakers wanted to use this to demonstrate Ant-Man's abilities against an established superhero and allowing him to sort of be on that same level as the Avengers. It's not very important to the film, but it's important to the larger picture. The next sequence, obviously, is to have a last-minute complication. So Cross shows up to invite Hank to the presentation next night, which is obviously of his cross particles and Yellow Jacket suit. It's also when the heist is to take place. So it's unclear to see how much he knows about Hank's plans, but Cross immediately calls Hope right after, asking her to increase security for the event. Now, Scott says that they need to alter the plan, so he brings in his trio, Louis, Dave, and Kurt, to help.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Now these three, they bring back that funny element to the film. No, it's not like the film was missing it, but they have that comic relief energy. And, last minute people mean last minute uncertainties. And after all, that's just the basis of the tension in a heist movie. All of this occurs, and then Scott sneaks into Cassie's room and sort of reminds himself, but also the audience, about the ultimate motivation. And then, obviously, the main heist is the last and most important beat of a heist film. In most cases, these plans work incredibly with just a few complications, just, to add some tension, up to a certain point, when it goes all wrong. So in Ant-Man, Scott shrinks into the water main and floats on this raft of fire ants. Luis poses as a guard quite excitedly and reduces the water pressure installs Hank's poorly explained piece of technology from the Avengers headquarters scene. Luis likes to blend in by whistling. It's a small world, and that's a bit of Disney Marvel sort of synergy, if you will. Scott, he enters back through the building, through the bathroom sink using bullet ants, and he takes out another guard, fries the servers, plants bombs in the Cross Particles vault, and then goes for the Yellow Jacket suit. But meanwhile, Jim and his partner are harassing Hank for information about Scott, who they know, and have sort of figured out their plans. It's a minor complication. It's overcome with a little bit of a diversion from Dave and Kurt. So the heist seems to be going perfectly until Scott approaches this Yellow Jacket suit and everything goes crazy. So this is the last and potentially more important than the actual main heist beat of a heist film. It's when all of the best plans sort of fail and they're forced to improvise. It's the most exciting sequence of any heist film, but only if the plan is very established and the audience is invested in the characters. And Ant-Man does a great job at both. So Cross, he eventually reveals that he knows all about Hank's plan. He tries to shoot Hank, and in the confusion, Hope sort of saves him, but Hank gets shot in his arm, non-fatal gunshot. One of the crossbuyers escapes with a vial of the particles, and Cross escapes with the suit. Now, Hope has to tend to Hank and orders Scott to go after Cross. And Scott goes full Ant-Man. That's his hero moment. The film at this point had been more heist than superhero movie, but this is where, you have to flip that balance, and it works. Scott, he encounters two guards that shoot at him through the security glass. He shrinks, he jumps through a bullet hole in the glass, knocks out a guard, hangs onto a barrel of the other guard's gun, and then sort of runs along the top of the gun before knocking out the second guard. It's a classic showpiece action scene. It demonstrates potential and the use of the superhero for the future. Luis, he sets off the fire alarm to evacuate the building. He even carries out the guard that he knocked out. Scott then leads a swarm of carpenter ants to catch Cross on his helicopter, but Cross shoots Scott's favorite ant, Anthony, in the process. And, this is that Uncle Ben moment. Scott finds Cross and on the helicopter until the PIM Technologies building explodes. Now, the reaction of these particles makes the explosion shrink into itself, and it's nice. It's cool. With that, the heist is over, and then, the Marvel superhero climax begins. So many things about this movie are, unique and small, but it comes to fruition in the climax. Because, it's just Darren Cross in the Yellow Jacket suit and Scott Lang in the Ant-Man suit fighting it out in Cassie's bedroom, fighting and, enlarging Thomas the Tank Engine trains, and, just sort of going through the Ant-Man motions, really playing with the rules. Around this time, it's funny because critics were raising concerns about all of the world-ending stakes and, city-destroying climaxes. Maybe in response, maybe not. But Ant-Man, it starts a new series of MCU climaxes. And you see this through Civil War, Doctor Strange. Scott and Cross, they end up in that briefcase tumbling out of the helicopter, and they fight inside, causing bits of lifesaver candy to float around, iPhone play Plain Song by The Cure. They eventually land in a family pool and fight in the backyard until Cross is whacked by Scott into a bug zapper. And several times in the sequence, the film cuts from this sort of shrunken battle to a full-size perspective, and it makes everything seem really funny because it's really small. Eventually, it all ends with a little plop in the pool, very anticlimactic. And the frenetic fighting in the backyard ends with a little paddle thwack. It's a funny laugh. Eventually, Cross, he finds Cassie, which is what I was talking about earlier, and the battle moves into a train, Thomas the Tank Engine. Age of Ultron, a couple months earlier, ended with an entire city hovering over the Earth, threatening to destroy life on the planet. But Ant-Man, everything's smaller scale. Like I said, even the emotional stakes is just a father protecting his daughter. But they're still very high. These guys shrink and fight along the train like an old Western. Cross ends up in the path of Thomas the Tank Engine, and Cassie just sees these little toy trains derail, and it's really funny. Then they're randomly, the Thomas toy and a random ant are both enlarged by growth particles, and it adds a very surreal element to the fight. Scott eventually is unable to penetrate Cross's suit to disable it, so just like Janet, he disables his regulator and goes subatomic to save Cassie. Cross is killed because his suit is malfunctioning and it implodes, but Scott just keeps shrinking out of control. But what follows is this really delightful and completely unexpected series of what one can only refer to as psychedelic images. Scott, he shrinks to the size of atoms and keeps shrinking through exotic backgrounds until he passes through this really weird kaleidoscopic mirror realm. And I guess this is what the quantum realm is. But because he's thinking about Cassie, he pulls his mind together and fits normal-sized growing particles in his regulator and goes back to normal size. Anyway, Scott reunites with Cassie. His heroics earn him the chance to see her regularly, and Scott Lang is made unique among MCU heroes because he's just a goof. He's an everyman goof who's motivated by love for his daughter. It makes him different. It sets him apart. It makes him endearing endlessly. He escapes from the quantum realm, reignites the possibility for Hank to see his wife again as well, and hope for his mom, or her mom. Also, Scott and Hope have an off-screen kiss, which is a very funny scene as well. And then the movie ends with the last tip montage in which Luis informs Scott that Falcon is looking for him, kicking off what Ant-Man's role in Civil War would be. Now, I love these films, right? I love superhero movies, I love MCU movies, but I don't watch them just like that all the time. Not anymore, at least. Not since I became a bona fide film major art snob. But Ant-Man is the MCU's. It's the one MCU movie that I'm most likely to just watch, just randomly. Especially one that when I'm looking for something that's fun, it's engaging. But on a side note, it's the only movie that I... Okay, well, not Ant-Man, sorry. Ant-Man 2, Ant-Man and the Wasp, I think is the one of the first movies I ever saw on holiday. But, the movie, it shouldn't have worked as well as it did. Especially not after, a decade of development, last-minute departures of a huge writer-director. But it works because it's funny, it's light, it understands that it's a heist movie, but also because of its incredibly likable cast. Paul Rudd and Michael Pena are just incredible in this film. I know I overuse that word so much, but they're just absolutely fantastic. It's nice to see Michael Douglas have fun with his role. There's serious parts, but obviously, like Guardians of the Galaxy, they're undercut by humor. And Ant-Man also has this abundance of incredible, unique imagery, like Guardians of the Galaxy and Doctor Strange, that are appropriate for a character like this. You don't see other superheroes running or flying with ants or riding on a raft made of ants or, going through weird psychedelic quantum realms as often. Other superheroes, they can't be found inside vacuums. They can't be found inside water pipes or even fighting in a briefcase with a bunch of lifesavers. And then, obviously, at the end, the incredible jazzy score, it brings it all together. It has a lot of, heist film references with the bongos and the horns. So it feels nice. It feels home. Obviously, all credit to Marvel Studios for taking such a niche character into such widespread fame. For context, Avengers Age of Ultron made $1.4 billion at the worldwide box office, off of 365 as the production cost, whereas Ant-Man made $519 million off of a cost of $130 million. So both films made about 4 times their costs, but Ant-Man, like everything else about it, was on a smaller scale. It's obviously regarded as a minor Marvel film and not very essential, but not every film needs to be an Avengers film to be successful or important. Not every climax has to be about saving the world or destroying an entire city. Sometimes we need small. Sometimes smaller. It works. All right. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and leave us a review. You can also follow us on Twitter at GSMC_movies. Thank you for listening. This has been Shubh Nanda, and take care.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GS